Robert Langer is our next speaker. And I have another question for you. How many of you have got the Moderna COVID vaccine? Remember, we had the pandemic and a lot of vaccines? Yeah. Right. Oh, come on. So did you know that our next speaker, Robert, was one of the founders of the company? Robert is a scientist, he's an inventor, and a businessman. He could easily have gone into oil business industry when he was educated as an engineer, but he wanted to go into biomedicine. And he was the first to develop nano-engineered materials that enabled the controlled release or the regular flow of drug molecules. Bob, the floor is yours, and we are so happy that you will share your life story with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to see you, and it's really an honor to be able to talk to you all today and to be here for this ceremony and to share it with people like David and Doris and others. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I got started and my life. So my dad, he actually grew up. I'm older. My dad was born in 1916. You know, he ended up growing up in what was called the Great Depression in America, where people, lost a lot of money and things like that. He fought in World War II as a navigator. And when he got done, he was very concerned about his family. Like, he didn't want what happened to him, being poor and things like that, to happen to us. So, he did small businesses. He basically worked running a pool hall in Troy, New York, and owning a tiny liquor store in Albany, New York, which is where I grew up. My mom, she was a stenographer, but mostly spent time taking care of my sister and myself. And so I grew up in this little house in Albany, New York, and I had I'd like to think, normal childhood. I had friends, I'd play sports, baseball, football, and stuff like that. In terms of science, my dad did get me like presents, and my mom, like an erector set that you could build robots, and had a rocket launcher that you could, shoot at other people, and things like that. And they also gave me like this microscope set where you could watch shrimp eggs hatch, and chemistry set, where I'd always liked magic. I still love magic, where you'd mix chemicals together and they change color. And I did try to make things that would, like gunpowder once, to blow things up, but I didn't succeed at any rate. And I think what you heard both from David and Doris's books. So the books that I would read were like Tom Swift, and he was like this fiction guy, but he had made submarines and flew into outer space and things like that. And then the other set of things I read were these sports books about a guy named Chip Hilton, and he would keep playing sports, and he'd always be losing in the beginning, but in the end, he always won. And so I think all those had some influence on me. And I'd go through, grammar school and then high school and college. One of the things, though, that I really upset me as I was in high school and in college is I just, first I did terrible in English and French. And I think one of the reasons I maybe went into things like science and math were I was so bad at everything else. But, what happened as I was in high school, and college, I just kept, when I go to a class, and my classes even would be smaller than what you're sitting in, I would just start daydreaming, and after maybe the first minute or two, I would just completely stop paying attention. And the consequence of that from a grade standpoint is, some classes I didn't do very well in. English in particular was really hard for me. Today, what I realize is I had what's called attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, and it was really hard for me to do that. So I tried to keep teaching myself. The best example is like English. I kept doing terrible over and over and over again. And of course, I had to interpret poems, which I also wasn't very good at. But finally they came to Shakespeare, and I thought, geez, now I'm going to get an F. But I had a good memory, and so I keep studying, reading things over and over again. And they asked you to identify, quotes, and I think what they meant by that was like, what did it kind of mean? But what I would do is I would say, well, actually, it's on page 52, Act 5, Scene 3, lines 22 to 24. So finally, for the first time in my life, I got a decent grade in English. But it was the same kind of thing in college. I just had tremendous difficulty, so I kind of kept trying to do I'm an engineer, a chemical engineer, so I started doing problem sets, and I kept doing them, and so, but before that, it was just very, very hard for me. So, I mean, today there's medicines for it and things like that, but I had a very hard time learning things. So, at any rate, from a career standpoint, when I was in high school, I was good in math and science. Like I say, not good in other things. And my dad and guidance counselor said, well, you should be an engineer. And I honestly thought at that time engineers ran railroad cars. And I couldn't see why being math and science would be so good for that. But anyhow, I became an engineer. In my first year, I went to Cornell University, and the only class I did well in and liked was chemistry. So I became a chemical engineer. I always like to tell people I wish I was really systematic. It wasn't. But I got done with Cornell, and some people got jobs. I think I got a couple jobs to run chemical plants, which really would have been a disaster for those plants if I'd taken them. They probably would have blown up. But I thought, well, maybe I should go to graduate school, sort of put this off, learn some more things. And I was fortunate enough to get in MIT. And I liked MIT because still I didn't really have a very clear idea of what I wanted to do, but they had many different aspects of chemical engineering that you could pick, like more medical parts or electrochemistry or other kinds of things. It was very diverse. So I ended up picking a thesis, and actually I really was disappointed. I didn't feel that what I was doing was that important. I spent most of my time being a graduate student helping start this school for very poor high school kids in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and developing new math and chemistry curriculum to try to make math and chemistry more interesting. When I got done, and I loved that, and when I got done with my degree at MIT, almost all my friends, they went into the oil industry. They paid huge amounts of money, and that's what chemical engineers did. So I thought, well, I should probably do what everybody else does. So I applied to some of these companies, and I actually got 20 job offers, 4 from Exxon alone. And it wasn't like I was great or anything, but they just had so many jobs. But I felt like when I started looking at what they did, they, one of the Exxons, they said, gee, if you could just increase the yield of this one chemical by a tiny percentage, they said that would be great. It would be worth billions of dollars. But I thought to myself, I don't want to spend my life increasing something by 0.1%. To me, that seemed incremental. And it made me think what I did want to do. And so actually, I tried to, since I liked doing the high school chemistry things, I applied for different jobs developing chemistry curricula, but nobody would hire me. But I kept thinking, how could I use my education to help people? And so I thought about medicine, and I applied to different medical jobs, and also nobody would hire me. Finally, one man, and I'll show a picture of him in a few minutes, Judah Folkman, hired me at Boston Children's Hospital. And he had this sort of idea that everybody thought was crazy, that if you could stop blood vessels, maybe that would be a new way to someday treat cancer. And I didn't know anything really much about biology, but I thought it sounded like a great idea. But there was no way to really study blood vessels, so we had to invent one. And there's certain places in the body, and there's also chick eggs, that have almost no blood vessels. And so what we wanted to do was come up with little tiny particles that could deliver the molecules I was trying to find to stop blood vessels from growing. And so we needed to make these particles, and we needed to have something come out of them over a period of time. And nobody had been able to do that before for molecules that were of a certain size. It's kind of like we're too big to walk through that wall. So the literature and even very famous people told us this was an impossible thing to do. And they were pretty close to being right. I kept working on this. I spent over 2 years working on it. I found over 200 different ways to get this to not work. But eventually we did get it to work. And I thought that was great. But then I tried to get research grants for it, and everybody kept saying, well, it's got to be wrong. So my first 9 research grants were rejected. And then I tried to get, again, a faculty position in chemical engineering, which was my background, and no chemical engineering department in the country would hire me. Finally got a job in a nutrition department, and the reason I got it was the guy who was the head of it was kind of a benevolent dictator kind of department head, and he liked me. So he offered me a job, but he didn't ask anybody else in the department what they thought, which would have been okay, except the year after I joined the department, he left. So a lot of the faculty told me I ought to leave too. Anyhow, so I had a very rocky start, but I just kept being persistent, and eventually, things worked out okay. And those little particles that I mentioned, that's sort of the basis of, when you have these vaccines, there's little nanoparticles that people use. I did one other thing that also got people thought was pretty crazy when I was working as a professor. I really wanted the work we did. I wrote scientific papers. We still write lots of scientific papers. They've been cited a lot. But I really wanted the work we did to make an impact on people's lives. So what I did is I also wrote patents, and we started companies on that. And again, in the 1980s, professors didn't like that. They thought that was a bad thing to do. But those companies have created products that have really saved and improved the lives of now billions of people. Not just Moderna, there's others too. And I'll go over some of those things. So I thought I'd just show you a few pictures. This is me as a little boy, a little bit older. This is me at Cornell. This is my mom and dad, and that's me with the hair there, my sister. And fortunately, one other thing is to have a good partner. This is my wife, Laura, who actually does have a background in neuroscience. And that's actually been great for me because not only, she sort of understands like some of what I go through. This is our family today, my 3 children and me and Laura. That's Judah Folkman in the back with me, and he was just a wonderful mentor. And I'm going to end in a second with pieces of advice, but finding a great mentor, I think, is really, really very, very important. Great role models, Doris mentioned her dad and Professor Hubel. I think having really good role models and mentors is very important. Here's my lab today. We have a house on the beach in Cape Cod. I also, along the way, met some interesting people. This is when I was getting an honorary degree in New York, and the guy you see with me he's a little taller than me. It's Magic Johnson, who's a famous basketball player. Here is one of the companies we started, in fact, is, you never know where science is going to go. I mean, most everything we've done, has been in medicine. But, when you write these patents, and you discover some of these molecules, they can end up being used for anything. So it turned out that some people, one of my students, he was a venture capitalist, said, well, we wanted to start a company in hair. And so we came up with some ideas of how you could use some of these molecules, to thicken hair or to prevent frizz or things like that. And we got this young woman involved and just came to our lab a number of times. And then I, along the way, also met people like this for a couple of other honors, presidents and queens, and that's been interesting too. But I thought I'd end just really with some advice, and actually I can't really do better than David and Doris. I think all of the things they said are exactly right, and I think those, and I'll just say a couple of maybe in different ways and a couple of other things. The first thing is to do something you love. I mean, you heard about following your passion. I totally believe in it. I've had students come to my office and say, well, I'm studying chemical engineering, but I don't like chemical engineering. And I said, well, you shouldn't do it. I said, well, my parents told me I have to do it. It makes more money than any other job. But I told her, I think that's not a good, and start crying. And I tell people, but I always think doing something you love, that's the most important thing. I think secondly is when you do something, I always think it's good to dream big dreams. That's actually, as bad as ADHD might have been, I just daydreamed all the time, and I've always dreamed. And I think if you dream about things, and I think Doris mentioned this in a different way. She probably, is much smarter, doesn't need to do what I do. But, if you dream about ways that you can change the world and make it a better place. By the way, if you do that, and I hope people do dream about things like that, you're probably going to run into roadblocks and failures. And failure's okay. I think that's a second piece of advice that I'd give. Also, since all of you are probably applying to college, one of the things that I thought about in college admissions, and I'm saying this in general, it's probably good to be great at one or two things rather than fair at many. And I think that people look at that. I mentioned the point about mentors. I also think you always, when you're in high school and even in undergraduate and college, the way you're judged is how good are your answers to other people's questions. But really in life, what's really important is the questions you ask. I often think of my job as professor of helping students, move from somebody who can give good answers to asking good questions. And finally, maybe this will also sound trite, but I don't think there's anything more important than being a nice person. Everybody who you meet, whether it's people who you might not even think that much of, or people who haven't been nice to you, I still think, I always think about that golden rule about doing to others as you'd have them do it to you. It's easy to say that, but not so easy to do. So those are my pieces of advice. And like I say, it's really a pleasure to speak to you all today. Thank you.
So we're ready for questions. Please, who would like to start? Please.
Can these things you're working with go into gene modifying or modification for sicknesses like autism or Down syndrome?
Could you repeat the first part of the question?
Can these things go into genetical modification?
Yeah, well, so if you look at things like, the answer is yes if you understand it well enough. I think the big thing in science, and that's why it's so important if you look at, say, the kind of work that Doris and other people have done in neuroscience and other areas of biology, if you understand what you're trying to fix, things like messenger RNA, which is the basis of the COVID vaccine, and actually the basis of new cancer vaccines that I hope will be coming out, and many other things. But if you need to know what your target is. You need to have enough of an understanding of what those targets are. If you understand it, then the answer is absolutely yes. You could take a messenger RNA that might treat autism, let's say, if you knew what the problem was exactly or what caused it, and you could give it to somebody, and hopefully you'd see an improvement.
Thank you. We have another question here.
What kept you going when you kept on getting rejected?
Yeah. So the question is, what kept me going when I kept on being rejected? I think a couple things. One is I'm a very stubborn person. I think that, and two, I really could see with my own eyes, I didn't really go into detail on it, but when we did the work to try to stop blood vessels, I could see it with my own eyes. The assays we used, we were looking under a microscope every day, and when we gave these, certain molecules to the tumor, we could just see the vessels, stopped in their track. And we repeated the experiment quite a number of times, and it kept happening. So I really believed that was, that had to work. And I also believed that, sometimes we put dyes in these little nanoparticles, and I could keep thinking, and again, most of the time when I did different designs, it didn't work. Nothing either came out, or if it did, it came out like that. But I remember one time what we did, and I repeated the experiment a number of times, day after day after day, I'd see the dye come out. And so I really felt that these things were working. And so that was one set of things, is really being stubborn, believing in the science. You know, and I was also fortunate. I had some good friends who I think were very supportive and, you know, would go through similar things. And, you know, sharing those experiences, you know, was very helpful to me.
Did I see a question on this side, or?
There's one there, I know, too.
There's one here?
She did.
Yeah.
My question is, how do you find a study technique that works for you?
How do I find a
Study technique that works for you
study
personally?
technique? Ah, well, so that's a very good question. I mean, my study technique, I mean, and it's probably a terrible technique, is to read the same thing over and over and over again. You know, that's what I did with organic chemistry, you know, to try to learn it. I just kept reading it and reading it. And then I also do a tremendous number of problem sets. You know, again, part of it's that, you know, I'm like an engineer, or I am an engineer, I suppose, but I would keep doing problem sets. And I think those two things really are I wish I could say it was very profound, but, you know, it's not. But those are the two things that I just kept doing. Because it wasn't easy for me to learn like in a class. But the problem sets, if you could do them, you know, that helped a lot. And sometimes, you know, you could get a set of answers, you know, so you could see if you were right.
Please raise your hand now. I think we've come to a conclusion, Bob.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks so very much. And thank you also, Bob, for reminding us of the importance of being a nice person.